This is the narrated PowerPoint on classical rhetorical theory of metaphor. So for our reading, I suggest you start with classical rhetoric for the modern student, especially if you feel like you need a refresher on the differences between metaphors and figures, or tropes and figures. Metaphors are a type of trope. A trope depends upon a turn of phrase or turn of a word often. Figures are things like analogies, and they're more dependent upon sentence structure, such as the A is to B is C is to D model that you've been taught when you took standardized tests. Before you dive into Aristotle, but it's up to you, of course. So some facts about Aristotle's life. You can see when he lived. He has kind of what we might think of as a scientific background, or what we think of science today, with his father having been the court physician for the royal family. The Macedonian royal family, those were the ones that produced Alexander the Great. They were just north of Greece, of uh, the peninsula that is basically Greece. But his father died when he was 17, so he was sent to Athens, and he lived most of his life in Athens, though he was always considered a foreigner because he wasn't born there. As a matter of fact, when he left in 322, he said he was doing so lest Athens sin twice against philosophy. And what he meant was, unless, in case the Athenians decided to execute him, as they had Socrates, because the Macedonians were starting to stir up militarily, and they actually, not long after, they actually overran and overtook Athens and ruled it for a while. And Aristotle, actually, at that time, he left and went back to an island where he had a house that actually had belonged to his mother, and he died there of natural causes, so far as we know. But he was very interested in politics his whole life as well. So Aristotle's teacher was Plato. As a matter of fact, he was Plato's star student. If Aristotle was late to class, Plato would hold the class until Aristotle arrived, and then he would say, we can begin. The mind is here. That was his nickname for him. And so far as we know, Plato wasn't saying this sarcastically. Of course, Plato's teacher was Socrates, and it is believed, it is tradition, that Aristotle's student was Alexander the Great, though there's no evidence of that. Aristotle wrote the political theory that our government is based on, government by the one, the few, and the many, or the president, the legislatures, and the people. And Alexander was a military dictator. The only thing they really had in common is they were both interested in everything, and that included the sciences, or what we think of as the sciences today. Aristotle would call it natural philosophy. Aristotle's bread and butter course, after he was a student at Plato's Academy, he taught there until Plato's death, and then he started his own school. But his bread and butter course was a rhetoric course. And that was the course that everybody wanted to take, especially young men, because they wanted to be a part of civic life in ancient Athens. Typically, dictionaries will list definitions in the order in which they develop, starting with the most recent one. And today, we tend to think, we hear the word rhetoric, or if somebody says, oh, that's just rhetoric, they usually mean display or bombast. And as we proceed down that list, it starts to sound more like what we would think of, or what we would be interested in terms of effective use of language and so forth. And then number 7 says the art of influencing the thought and conduct of an audience, and that's what Aristotle was interested in, and that's what he taught. The situations in which his students hoped to practice rhetoric were the judicial, the courts. In ancient Athens, we do see the beginning of the legal profession, but you could still defend yourself, very much so. And you could also participate with the writing of laws in the legislature. Epidictic, an epidictic rhetorical situation, an epidictic speech is one that either praises or blames someone. So you can see how that would have political significance as well. Here's Aristotle's definition of rhetoric: the ability to perceive in all situations the available means of persuasion. Aristotle thought that rhetoric appealed to us by the use of ethos, pathos, and logos. Of those, the one that's most recognizable, I think, from other words that develop from it in English, would be logos for logic. And of course, if there's a error in your logic, it can affect your ethos. A lot of times, people will look at ethos and say, "Oh, that means ethics." Well, ethics does have its root in ethos, but what the ancient Greeks thought of as ethos was the character of the speaker, the way that the speaker projected his character upon an audience, and it was all wrapped up in, of course, in the persuasive aspect. And of course, that can be related to logos. If I were to tell you that when I went to my first college teaching job, was a 4-year college, not a university, and a couple of years after I was there, it became a university. And then I came to Georgia Southern, which was Georgia Southern College when I came here, and a couple of years later, it became a university. If I were then to tell you that my secret power was turning colleges into universities, you might think that there was an error in my reasoning, and that would certainly affect my ethos. You might think it was an oversimplification, or I was confusing cause and effect. And those are certainly what we refer to as logical fallacies, which Aristotle wrote about in great detail in another of his treatises. Pathos, of course, that one you can go by how it developed in English into words like sympathy and empathy. It is the emotional appeal. And actually, Aristotle was concerned with there not being so much dependence upon emotional appeal in a court, but he recognized that people have emotional responses to different types of situations. That's something that political parties play on, certainly, even today. The rhetorical canon was something that was derived by Cicero, and it says that it says at the bottom that was formalized in De Inventione. It's also expressed in the Rhetorica ad Herennium, which is regarded as an anonymous document. No one claims it. Cicero didn't claim it. A lot of scholars think that Cicero actually wrote it and that it was some of his juvenilia, meaning that he wrote it when he was very young. He may have written it as part of studying to go to law for his law degree or law studies. It is a significant body of work, though. It is the most detailed rhetorical theory we have from the ancient world. Aristotle's Rhetoric is the first one, but it's not complete. We know that. That it's missing some major parts. The Rhetorica ad Herennium is complete, and it is much longer, more detailed. It has some errors. There's some flaws in it that we'll talk more about in just a few minutes. But in terms of what these are, invention we think of now as pre-writing practices, how we go about generating ideas. Organization is the different ways we might organize an essay when we write a comparison contrast paper versus an argumentative essay versus a narrative or descriptive paper, whatever. Style can be sentence structure, it can be word choice, it can also be metaphor. Delivery, the ancient Greeks and Romans were thinking about how you actually deliver a speech, the gestures that you make, making eye contact, all that sort of thing. Today we think, in terms of delivery, we think about the many different ways a message can be delivered. Is it best delivered as an email, as an animation, as a pamphlet, or what have you? We think more about the medium or the media. Memory, the ancient Greeks and Romans were thinking about memorizing. Today we think that's a bad idea to memorize speeches, that we need to be more extemporaneous, that make eye contact, all that sort of thing, have an element of spontaneity. Today we think about memory in terms of how memorable the message is, and a more memorable message is going to be one that's more effective. So Aristotle had great praise for metaphor. He also said that it couldn't be taught, as we see here, and then he proceeds to teach it, of course. It's also the mark of genius. In the Poetics, he expresses the models for both metaphor and analogy. The model for a metaphor is A is to B. For an analogy, it's A is to B is C is to D, which is something that you were probably introduced to when you first started taking standardized testing. That comes from Aristotle. He also starts to define it in the Poetics. And what he means here by species and genus and all that sort of thing actually has to do with his model for writing definitions. And the model is species, genus, and differentia. The species is the thing to be defined. The genus is the general category in which it fits, and the differentia is how it differs from other items in that category. For example, if our species was a flip-flop, what is a flip-flop? What general category into what does it fit? Is it a rubber sandal? No, it's a circuit. Okay, well, there's lots of different types of circuits. What type of how is it different from all the other types? Well, it can assume one of two stable states at any given time. Example would be a light switch. Aha, that's defined for us. So that's what he means by species and genus and so forth. So he actually goes as far to say that every word, is either current or strange, or it can be metaphorical. What he means by strange there is foreign, in another language. And newly coined can also, as we'll see, be metaphorical as well. He's saying here basically language is metaphorical. For example, he's saying that there's no term for how the sun scatters its rays. And he says, well, that's, and so this is an example of language being created. We use metaphor to create descriptions, for example, that we don't have. And he says that's why the poet has, the poet there was Homer, sowing the God created light. Here's another one that's more in line with scientific and writing. The ancient people had huge respect for riddles. Today we think of them as just something that children like to tell us over and over again. The same one sometimes. But the ancient people thought of riddles as challenges to our thought, our thinking processes. And in this case, what he's talking about is the riddle, I marked how a man glued bronze with fire to another man's body. And what he was talking about here was the medical process at the time that was known as bleeding. And this seems barbaric to us today, though I understand it would do a little bit of good, not as much as they hoped it would. But it was still practiced up through the early 19th century by doctors. So, but anyway, this is this process for um, attaching what they would do is they would take a warm vessel and attach it to the part of the body they were bleeding, and this was believed to make it bleed more quickly. Uh, but the application of the cupping glass, that was what they would use to catch the blood with, is here called gluing. And so here they're using riddles, and you think about riddles are a way of uncovering ideas in a sense. And so that's what metaphor is doing here. It's not only creating new words, but it's also creating new knowledge, and that's important. Uh, the great big word for that in philosophy is epistemology, the creation of knowledge. As a matter of fact, in the posterior analytics, and that's a treatise on logic, and that when I say Aristotle, I say who was he, and you say, oh, he was a philosopher. As a philosopher, he was basically he's best known for his work on logic. He did a lot of work in other areas, and certainly in what we now think of as biology, that sort of term didn't exist for a couple thousand more years. But here in this case, what he's saying is the way that we learn is metaphorical because we learn new material based upon what we know. So, and here he's saying that basically that the creation of new knowledge is rhetorical. He's talking about the idea of using an enthymeme or a syllogism. A syllogism is, you use it most commonly, like with, it can be mathematically represented by if A equals B and B equals C, then A equals C. Premise 1, A equals B. Premise 2, B equals C. Therefore, A equals C. Or we can say Socrates is a man, all men are mortal, therefore Socrates is mortal. And so what he's saying is that those types of that type of reasoning um, is rhetorical, and that's important too, in terms of thinking about the way that knowledge is created. So now, if we take this and we contrast it with Rhetorica ad Herennium, it's a little disappointing. This is about all they have about metaphor. Uh, when a word applying to one thing is transferred to another, and there's plenty of evidence in the Rhetorica ad Herennium that whoever actually wrote it was working very closely with Aristotle's rhetoric, very probably with the complete treatise, not just the partial one that we have today. And you can see that there's just like a couple of paragraphs and some really bad examples of metaphors. Unfortunately, this is what we have today. This is something from the internet I got from a grammar guide, and you can see they quote Aristotle, but what they quote is pretty shallow. And so is the rest of the explanation, and then there's examples. You know. Well, what's the big deal anyway? Well, metaphor has been important since the time of Aristotle for creating knowledge, new knowledge in the sciences, or what we think of today as the sciences anyway. Good example, Rene Descartes, who was I think therefore I am guy, also wrote a treatise on light, and he's credited with saying light is a wave. He never actually wrote that, but his readers after they had read what he had written about light said, oh, so you're saying, Descartes, that light is like a wave, and that's how it came to be attributed to him. And so it was like that for about 100 years or so, and then Isaac Newton said, no, wait a minute. He noticed something that people would actually notice since ancient times, and how sometimes when light strikes water, it's broken up into bands of color. Well, by that time they had prisms, and in terms of looking at it, Newton was saying, no, wait a minute, light couldn't be a wave. Look at how light is broken up into bands of color by this prism. Light must be a particle. And that held sway for a couple hundred years until Thomas Young, early 19th century, um, British physicist, did what he referred to as the double slit experiment. In the double slit experiment, you have three partitions. The first one has one hole in it. The second has two. So you can see the hole in the first one there, the far left, is in the middle. The two holes in the second partition moving to the right are above and below the first one. What Young was doing was what he was interested in seeing was when the light came through that hole, would it go through the one at the top or the one at the bottom? What he saw was what you see at the far right, bands of light and darkness, which meant it was going through both and then spreading out on the partition, the third partition, moving to the right. And so this meant to Young decided that light has particle properties and it has band or wave properties. Particle properties and wave properties. How could that be? Well, it's an idea that we still accept today. Here's a paragraph from a textbook that I found online, and this is something that isn't unique to this text, this idea of the dual wave particle nature of light, which means that we think and describe light as a wave or as a particle according to how we need to think about it, basically. For example, here's light moving down a fiber optic cable. When it's doing that, it's a wave. Light is a wave. Fiber optic cables are what bring us the internet. Basically, there is a glass tube or a bunch of glass tubes, but it allows information, data to move at the speed of light, and that's why we can people can have sword fights online through their computers with people who are thousands of miles away. When the computer gets to our screen, it breaks up into particles. So here's light as a particle. I guess it was supposed to represent photons or something. But this is what's important about metaphor. It's used to describe science. And if we don't know that that's how it's to be used, then it doesn't get used. But that's how science has advanced in the past. So it needs to continue to be taught. And people need to continue to talk about it. And there's also another way in which metaphor is impacting our lives is with artificial intelligence. Artificial intelligence has a terrible time trying to understand metaphors. But it will someday. And the way they're doing that is by teaching machines to learn. But anyway, this is kind of an introduction to what we'll be talking about the next couple of weeks. Questions? I'll see you online.